All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another installment of Draco Sinister. So, this is another chapter that I actually had to edit quite considerably because, again, more running around, more just draggy, laggy stuff to the plot line. We didn't need it. We didn't need it at all. So, um, I think there is a trigger warning for this particular chapter, but I don't remember exactly the context, so I'm just going to say there's a trigger warning here. For whatever reason, if you don't feel like being triggered by just heavy subjects, maybe just sit this one out. But without further ado, guys, let's just get right into it. Chapter 14, Blood of the Founders.
The same Zonko pencils? Ron was saying. The ones you used to draw the Marauders map? I can't believe it.
There was such an achingly wistful tone to Ron's voice that nearly made Sirius smile. "Here," he said, "you can see them if you want." And he pushed the small box of pencils through the gap in the wall and saw Hermione's small hand come forward to retrieve it. "Sirius," she called, her voice muffled by the stone wall between them, "did you draw the map?" "No," Sirius replied. "Remus did, and Peter helped. They were better draftsmen than James or I were." "So you don't know how they managed to make it come to life?" Sirius looked at the gap in the wall through which Hermione's voice was emanating. "Well, they stole the school floor plans and traced them over with the Zonko's pencils. They're meant to make drawings come to life, but they tend to work a little too well."
Too well?
Ron's voice now, sounding curious. "What I mean is, say you were to draw a bowl of porridge that you could actually eat. You could eat it, but it would give you a horrid stomach pain. I could tell you a story about James and a cranberry scone, but I won't. There were some nasty accidents." And as the words left his lips, there was a groaning sound, and a section of the wall between his cell and the one holding Hermione and Ron suddenly swung outward with a creak, as if it were hinged. A squarish section of wall had been transformed into a door, and on the other side stood Ron, and next to him Hermione, a Zonko's pencil in her hand and an astonished look on her face. "You drew a door," said Sirius, shaking his head in amazement, although he had long ago accepted that Hermione was cleverer than anyone had a right to be.
"I really didn't think it would work," she murmured, gazing upward.
"It's a bit crooked," said Ron appraisingly, stepping through it so that he was now in Sirius's cell. Hermione looked mildly affronted.
"Not that that matters. It worked,"
he added quickly.
"It doesn't really help us, though, does it?" said Hermione, a bit mournfully. "I mean, we can't draw on the bars. They're too far apart."
Sirius looked at them, both thoughtfully. "Could you draw me the cell where Harry and Draco are, from memory?" Hermione looked startled, and Ron was staring at him as if he were mad.
"I can try," she said feebly. "Have you got any parchment?"
Sirius shook his head. "I want you to draw it as close to life-size as you can, on the wall, of there, and—" Hermione looked at him.
"What?"
"Try to hurry." It took almost the whole box of pencils for Hermione to complete the sketch. The lead was very soft, and the wall very rough. She worked slowly, grinding each pencil down to its nub, scraping her fingertips against the stone until they started to bleed a little. In the meantime, Ron filled Sirius in on what had been going on. The older man felt a sense of disquiet at the mention of Fleur's betrayal, but by then the rough image of the cell was finished, and the two looked to see what Hermione had done. It was all there, the high walls, the wardrobe, The tapestries with their embroidered dragons and their motto, In hoc sigil vinces.
That's all I can do, said Hermione, as she clutched the stub of the last pencil in her hand.
That's all right. The power is there. I can feel it, Sirius said. He glanced at the sketch and smiled as 2 dots labeled Harry Potter and Draco Malfoy popped into view. He turned to Ron and Hermione and asked, Are you ready to go through? You'll have to concentrate on the cell, your memories of it, the way it feels to stand in there and look at the walls and the ceiling. Don't think of this dungeon at all.
What about you? You haven't been in there, so what can you concentrate on? Ron asked.
Take my hands, Sirius instructed, pocketing the last of the pencils. My focus will be on Draco and Harry. I think a combination of that and your efforts will pull us through. The 3 of them moved silently in front of the drawing and concentrated on the cell and on Draco and Harry. Sirius could almost feel the pulse of the charm at his wrist as he concentrated on the drawing and the boys. And as he gazed at the lines of the drawing on the wall, they seemed to leap out into 3 dimensions, gathering reality to them. He heard footsteps and saw a faint blue glow bleed out from the drawing on the wall. As one, they closed their eyes and stepped forward. Ben, Ginny had decided, was a lovely person, and it really was too bad that he wasn't from her time. He was endlessly solicitous about her welfare, making sure she had enough to eat, enough to drink, and wasn't bored, while he hurried about, packing and making various preparations. As he bustled about, suddenly there was a soft pop as someone apparated into the tent. Ginny gave a little shriek of fright and leapt backward. The intruder was a young man around Ben's age. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded rudely, looking not at all pleased to encounter a teenage girl where he had presumably expected to encounter Ben. Ginny opened her mouth to reply, but Ben cut across her, a look of surprised resignation on his face. "Gareth," he said, "what are you doing here?" The man called Gareth scowled as he brandished a piece of half-crumpled parchment in the air of Gryffindor's face. As he did so, Ginny noticed a thick band of what looked like red glass around his wrist. "I came here to ask you what the hell this is," continued the other man, his green eyes narrowed in suspicion. Ben edged behind Ginny, looking martyred. "Gareth, you didn't have to apparate all this way." "The bloody well did!" fumed the other. "What kind of letter is this?" He glared down at the parchment, unrolled it, and started reading out loud. "And so, I will be going into the future to fight a battle unlike any we've fought before. If I die there and do not return, I trust you will take my son and raise him as if he were your own." Ginny goggled at Ben. "You have children?" "Just the one," said Ben absently. Ginny was speechless. "Also, Ginny, this is my cousin, Gareth," Ben explained, as if trying to change the subject. "Gareth, this is Ginny." "I'm the heir of Hufflepuff," she said by way of introductions. "Congratulations," he snarled, and Ginny felt a sudden urge to kick him in the ankle. Almost as if he were... But at that moment, Ben stepped between Gareth and Ginny. Whether to protect Ginny from the angry man, or the other way around, it was difficult to tell. "Gareth, don't be an ass," he said. 2 bright red dots of rage appeared on Gareth's cheekbones. "Oh, I'm the one behaving like an ass? Aside from the fact that you sound like a puffed-up poncy git in this brilliant epistle of yours, it looks like you're planning to get yourself killed," snapped Gareth, still glaring at his cousin. "You moron." "I am not a moron. I beg to differ." "Look, don't you think it's Ben's decision what he wants to do?" interrupted Ginny, weeks of having witnessing Draco and Harry's fights making her acutely aware that this could go on for hours without ever getting anywhere. Gareth glared at her coldly, but she held her ground. "I appreciate that he's your cousin." "Second cousin," said both Gareth and Ben in unison. "Whatever. The point is, it's his business, and I think it's very brave of him. He could be the instrument that destroys the Snake Lord once and for all, which—" She broke off at the look on Gareth's face. "You do know that the Snake Lord is my father?" asked Gareth in a deathly cold voice. That brought Ginny up short, but before she could say anything else, Gareth continued. "Don't bother making amends," he said, still in that icy tone. "He may have been my father, but I loathed him." Ginny stared at him. "Then why are you so determined to keep Ben out of it?" "You can't win against him," said Gareth simply. "He's too powerful. It took the power of the House of Wizards combined to bring him down, and even then he couldn't be killed. What can you do? You're only a child. He'll destroy you, massacre your armies where they stand, and carve flutes for Veela children out of your bleached bones." "Gareth," said Ben with exasperation. "We have something they don't have," said Ginny confidently. "What?" "The future heir of Slytherin is on our side." Gareth looked at her narrowly. "Are you sure?" "Yes," said Ginny, and hoped that she was right. Gareth glanced at Ben, his eyes wide and inquiring. Ben looked annoyed. "I was trying to tell you, Gareth. Do you understand now? I have to go." The heir of Slytherin, now looking slightly deflated, looked back at Ginny. "Then I want to go with you." "You can't. You haven't got an heir," Ben pointed out, looking weary. "If you died, that would be the end of the Slytherin line, and that would alter history." "So I'm being left out because I haven't procreated?" Gareth snapped. "Yes," said Ben with finality. "That doesn't seem fair." "It's an imperfect world," said Ben. "Now, are you going to be helpful or not? We're dealing with a lot of unstable magic here, and frankly I think we shouldn't be wasting time. We've got to convince an army to follow us into an uncertain future to battle the evilest wizard who ever lived. Incidentally, can we borrow one of your dragons?" Gareth looked indignant. "One of my dragons? Do you know how expensive they are? And if you were to lose one of them while in the future—" The other man broke off at Ben's look of defiance. Ginny sighed to herself. It was a good thing, she thought, that they had all the time that magic could afford them. It looked like they were going to need it. "Well, that was very—" Draco was in the middle of saying, then jumped as a sudden shimmering rainbow refraction appeared on the opposite side of the room. It blurred, and without any warning, Sirius, Ron, and Hermione appeared out of the wall, stepping forward as if they stepped through a door. Draco barely had a chance to get a look at them before Harry noticed, and, without a word, bolted towards them. Sirius threw his arms around Harry and hugged him so hard that Harry's feet lifted off the floor. Draco stood where he was, feeling awkward. Sirius had put Harry down now, but still had one hand on his shoulder. Then Ron was suddenly at Harry's side and began whispering something low in his ear, and Draco saw Harry go white. "The cloak," he was saying now as Draco crossed the room to where they stood. "They took my dad's cloak. We have to get it back. What we have to do is get out of here before his minions come back," said Sirius, trying to turn Harry around to face him, but Harry pulled out of his grasp. Sirius looked surprised, but relented somewhat. "I'm so sorry about James's cloak, Harry. There are other things I could give you that belong to your father, though." Harry turned to look at Sirius, as his godfather reached into a pocket of his robes and drew out something about the length of his hand, which looked like an intricately decorated silver thimble, complete with a strap. He looked at it. "What is that?" Sirius smiled, the lines deepening at the corners of his eyes, then handed the object to his godson. The moment it touched Harry's hand, it seemed to leap to life, and suddenly began to expand in size. Harry jumped as it grew and became the scabbard for a longsword, carved all up and down with intricate and beautifully colored designs of leaves, birds, and animals. Hermione smiled nervously. "It's your key, Harry," she said. Harry didn't say anything, only looked at it mutely, then back up at Sirius. "A scabbard for a sword?" he said. Sirius nodded. "For the sword of Gryffindor." "But I don't know where the sword is anymore," said Harry. "It was in the wardrobe earlier. Slytherin must have taken it after we killed the Manticore." He looked over at Draco, who looked back at him steadily. There was something exhausting about Harry when he was surrounded by the people that he loved. Draco couldn't help but to feel automatically weary when he faced it. Sirius being there made matters worse. He vaguely wished Ginny were around. At least she seemed to have grown somewhat of a level head when it came to the boy who lived. Silently, he wished she'd return soon. "Draco." It was Sirius's voice, snapping him back to the present. Draco turned to regard the older man. "What?" he replied. "Are you all right?" Draco stared. "Shouldn't you be asking if Harry's all right?" "Harry's fine. You, however, have looked better." "I figured you'd be hacked off at me." "Hacked off?" Sirius shifted his weight onto his heels, his eyes level with Draco's. "It strikes me that you've had to make a lot of difficult choices these past few hours. Choices nobody should have to make. You've done better than anyone could have expected or asked. I'm proud of you." Draco stared at Sirius for a moment. No one had ever said that to him before. Not once. Not ever. "I didn't have a choice," he said. "There's always a choice," said Sirius, and rested his hand on the boy's shoulder. Draco continued to look at him. The backs of his eyes felt hot, and his throat felt too tight. In the silence, while he tried to figure out how to react, he saw Hermione reach out and touch him lightly on the shoulder. "You all right?" she asked. He nodded and looked past her to Harry and Ron with tired eyes. "We should go," he said. "For once I agree with Malfoy," Ron said. "I say we get the orb and get out of the castle. It really is too bad we don't have the cloak anymore." "I was told that in order to be rid of Slytherin, we would need to force him to give up the sword with his own hand," Draco cut in. "Who told you that?" Ron retorted, annoyed at having been interrupted. "Never you mind, Weasley. Who told us is on a need-to-know basis, and you don't need to know," said Draco. "Enough," said Sirius quietly, before Ron could retort. "Sniping up at each other isn't going to help. What we need to do is focus on formulating some kind of plan. Harry, I think you and the others should get out of the castle as soon as possible. I'll find Remus, and we can get the orb and bring it to you outside the castle walls. But I'm the only one who knows where the orb is," Draco interrupted. "That's not true," said Hermione, and Draco stared at her. "When Ron and I were looking for you, Sirius, we found Wormtail." Both Harry and Sirius jumped, as if they had both been dealt an electric shock. "What?" Hermione nodded, and Ron said, "Yeah, he didn't look too good either. Looks like old Slytherin took back that arm so generously given to him by you-know-who." Harry was dumbfounded. "You mean—" "Lopped it right off, mate," Ron said, and couldn't help the grin that spread across his freckled face. Harry's jaw dropped, and he looked at Sirius. Draco shifted in an agitated manner. "I knew there was something I forgot to mention," he he said. Harry turned back to him, looking slightly horrified.
You mean you knew Slytherin took his arm off?
Kinda hard to miss it when it's sitting on the table in front of you, Potter, Draco replied, looking not the least bit contrite. This information had the effect of rendering Harry and Sirius momentarily speechless, and Hermione decided that now would be as good a time as any to get back to the subject at hand.
Yes, it was really awful, but the point of the matter is, he told us where to find the orb. It's in the tapestry room. I remember it from the first time Slytherin brought me here. If I could figure out how to get back there, then
I'm not letting you go off on your own again, Harry cut in.
I wasn't on my own, she countered.
You're never alone with Ron Weasley, but you might as well be for all the good he does, Draco said scathingly. Ron made a move towards Draco, but Harry grabbed the back of his shirt. Sirius sighed, as the shocking news of Wormtail seemed to have been put away in his mind, for now. Since you know where it is, Draco, you and Hermione take Harry and go and get the orb. Meanwhile, Ron and I will go find Lupin. Then, when Ginny gets back, we can deal with the issue of destroying it.
I'd rather stick with Harry, Ron put in.
All right, you lot go together, Slytherin said. It's probably safer with the air of Slytherin anyway, and I'll likely have an easier time sneaking around the castle on my own. He looked at Draco. And when you have the orb, guard it with your life.
Certainly not,
said Draco, with the ghost of a mocking smile. I plan to guard it with my really big sword. All right then, said Harry. Let's go. As Sirius strode down the corridors alone, he knew he was exuding far more confidence than he felt. Back in the adamantine room, he had claimed to Harry and the rest that he knew exactly where he was going, but the truth was he hadn't a clue. Here and there he thought he recognized a shadowed doorway, like the one he, Lupin, and the Banshee woman, Raven, had been in. The flagstone floor seemed familiar, as did the curling serpent torch brackets and the arched, almost oval wooden doors set in the wall at intervals. And there, surely that was the door Raven had shown Lupin through? He paused in front of it, and then, before he had a chance to move, the handle of the door suddenly slid up, and it creaked open from the inside. Sirius backed up along the hallway and stared. Through the door came a trio of young women, clad in filmy white. Two were carrying lanterns, shining with a soft, pale light, and the tallest was playing a little harp that echoed with strange, sweet music. As they drew nearer, Sirius recognized them as Vila. They paused when they caught sight of him, their civil robes swinging around their slender bodies, and they giggled to each other.
Qui est le matroon? Qu'en effet avec lui?
Smirked the first.
Je pense meilleur, je pense oui.
Purred the second. Sirius, who could speak French fluently, had a second to realize that he was in absolute danger before he took a step back as they advanced on him en masse, smiling. Suddenly, another female voice cut into the scene, this one oddly familiar. Shoo! Shoo! Leave him alone, you bunch of darts! Sirius turned and stared. Standing in front of him, barefoot, wearing white robes and looking deathly pale, was Fleur Delacour. Her hands were jammed firmly on her hips, and she looked furious. The tallest Vila bared her teeth at this intrusion and said in a wheedling voice,
Fleur, why don't you leave us alone and let us have our fun?
Because I say so, barked Fleur, imperiously tapping her foot, and she stretched out one hand and, to Sirius's surprise, The Vila cowered back away from her. "Now, go!" Fleur commanded, and with a few parting hisses and some baring of teeth, the Vila turned and vanished off down the corridor. Fleur watched them go, and once they were safely out of sight, she turned to Sirius. "Are you all right?" she asked, her tone sympathetic. "My cousins, they get a little overexcited." Sirius nodded, mind whirling. "I have seen you before," she continued, her eyebrows knitting together. "You are a friend of Professor Lupin. I saw you in his office. You were in the fireplace." Sirius nodded. "I'm Sirius Black." "The professor, is he all right?" asked Fleur, widening her dark blue eyes. "He's with the other werewolves," said Sirius. "Let me lead you there," Fleur said earnestly, and began leading the way down the hall. Sirius hesitated for a moment, the memory of Ron's recollection of events making him momentarily nervous. She could be leading him into a trap. But at the end of the day, what other choice did he have? He followed. The door turned out to be a shorter distance than he remembered. Soon the door of ivory was looming up before them, and Fleur rapped upon it once, then pushed it open, letting Sirius walk in ahead of her. She came after him, shutting the door firmly behind her. Hermione had been worried that they would run into guards on their way to the orb. She had been worried that the resident monsters of the castle would delay them, or worse yet, they'd bump into Slytherin himself. But so far, nothing. As they moved further through the serpentine corridors, Hermione's mind began to wander away from the issue of being caught and began to focus on the one thing she had not been able to tell either Harry or Draco since they had met up again. The glass marble that Wormtail had given her. It sat like a secret on the inside of her pocket. It's not that she had meant to keep it a secret, but so far there hadn't been any time to explain. And now, squinting down the end of the hall and trying to find their way, it seemed like the most inopportune time to bring it up. Suddenly, she felt a hand on her arm, and she stopped and turned to see Harry. He wasn't looking at her, but rather something on the far wall. She turned to look and found herself staring at her own face. It wasn't a mirror, no. She had seen this face before, framed by hair that was like hers, yet somehow different. Wearing a dark blue dress. She heard Draco swear behind her and realized that none of the others had seen this before this moment. She, of course, had seen it when she had been kidnapped. Hermione wondered vaguely why Slytherin had moved it to this hallway, when suddenly Ron gave a shout, and all three turned to look at him. Mutely, the red-headed boy pointed to the other side of the hall, and they turned to look, then froze, staring. Advancing towards them from the far end of the hall were 5 tall, slightly stooped, gray-swapped figures whose scabbed and rotting hands protruded from the sleeves of their robes. Before them rolled a wave of intense and glacial cold. "Dementors," Hermione thought wildly. "Run!" yelled Harry. They ran, but not as a group. Pure adrenaline having taken over, Draco and Ron sprinted to the left, while Harry and Hermione turned and bolted to the right. The Dementors split like parting mist. The 2 of the 5 made in the direction Harry and Hermione had gone, while the other 3 pursued the heir of Slytherin and his accomplice. By the time Draco realized that the 4 of them had been separated, he and Ron had already zipped down a series of corridors and darted sideways towards a long staircase the color of polished bone. "Where are the others?" the other boy panted as they went. "I don't know," said Draco, and ran for the stairs. "Just keep going, Weasley." Ron followed without protest. They clattered up the stairs, around a corner, up another flight of stairs, and ran smack into a closed door. Without a second thought, Draco pulled the sword from the sheath hanging over his back. He looked at it, then at the very solid-looking door, then swung the blade, hard. The blade drove through the door, slicing off great chunks as if it were cutting through butter. He drew it back and swiped at the bolts with it. The sword sliced through them, and they clattered at his feet. Ron grabbed for the handle and wrenched it open. The door swung wide, and they dashed through it. Draco tried to slam it behind them, but it was too destroyed to hang properly and just dangled from its hinges. So instead, he turned to see where they had ended up. They were standing on a wide stone balcony that seemed to run in a circle around a tall, bone-colored tower. The balcony walls reached no more than chest height and were topped with crenellated battlements. Draco raced to the edge of the balcony and looked down. Far below and all around, he could see the tops of the forest trees stretching away towards the horizon. High above, stars and a half-moon gazed back at him and washed the sheer sides of the tower in a cool, milky light. There was no way to climb down that he could see, and no other exit than the one they had just come through. Ron was very pale in the moonlight, his freckles standing out like ink blots. "We're trapped," he said, and looked at Draco. "Can't you do anything?" Draco didn't say anything. "Malfoy," said Ron in a strangled voice. Draco turned and saw Ron staring off behind them with huge eyes. He spun around, feeling the blood drain from his heart. The three Dementors stood at the tower entrance, tall and remote and terrifying. The moonlight iced them with silver, throwing terrible elongated shadows over the flagstones, making them seem 10 times taller than they were. They paused, the blank, black spaces under their hoods indicating nothing at all. Then, slowly, they began to move forward, and a bright spear of cold shot through Draco, freezing his nerves, turning his blood to ice water. Swearing, Ron bent down and fumbled for his wand. Draco was beyond being able to think properly. "Get out," he said, and shoved Ron away from him, hard. He had a vague sense of Ron looking at him in surprise, saying, "Malfoy," and then his words bubbled away like speech heard underwater as the Dementors began to move forward, gliding instead of walking, and driving before them the cold. Draco hit the wall with his back, the uneven rocks driving into his shoulder. For a moment, the pain cleared his vision. Feet away, the Dementors were moving towards him, and he could see Ron standing by the tower entrance, staring at him. He was thinking that it was all very well and bloody good to be a Magid, but not actually that much use in times of crisis. He could try a Patronus spell, he thought, but then he'd never tried that on a real Dementor, having never contended with the glacial force of them, which seemed to suck all the will and energy and hope. If only he learned how to apparate. Everything seemed to be happening both very quickly and very slowly, and he realized suddenly that he had dropped his sword there on the balcony, the moonlight gleaming off its silvery hilt, just behind where Ron was standing. He reached out a hand, willing the sword to leap into his grasp, but it wasn't the sword of Slytherin, and nothing happened. He tried again, not even sure how to try. Had always been so effortless before. Nothing continued to happen. He heard his own despairing exclamation ring in his ears, but even that was driven away by the freezing mist that was rapidly dropping down over his vision. Ron's voice suddenly cut through the mist. He was shouting something, hoarsely. Draco looked up slowly and saw him running toward the balcony. He seized the sword from where it lay and spun around with it in his hand. His face contorted with some unnameable emotion as he swung his arm back and threw the sword as hard as he could. There was a brilliant flash of light, and by its illumination, Draco saw the sword winging towards him. He reached up and caught it by the hilt, then swung it down and forward, driving it hard into the body of the Dementor with all the weight and intent behind his swing as his father had taught him, just where its heart would have been if it had had one. There was a flash of light, brilliant and greenish in hue. Draco staggered back, half blinded, as the Dementor screamed a long, soulless cry of pain and rage. It was the first time he had ever heard one of these notoriously silent creatures make any sound. Clutching at the hilt of the sword, half buried in its body, the Dementor staggered backwards and toppled to the ground, writhing as Draco stared in fascinated horror. Immediately, the other two Dementors turned around and began rapidly moving towards him. He saw Ron turn to look at him, his face pallid, his eyes large and staring. Draco darted forward to seize at the sword buried in the body of the dead Dementor, but the others were too quick. They swerved in front of the corpse of their companion, cutting off his access as they glided towards him, terrible as an oncoming wave. Draco took a step back, and another step, and fetched up against the wall again, his breath coming hard in his ears, his hands shaking. He turned around and hopped up on top of the wall, looking down at the advancing Dementors, and below him the wall dropped sheer as a cliff to the treetops below. The stars and the moon beat down with a blinding silver light, and time seemed to slow down to this one sliver of a second, pinned between the earth and the sky. There was a whooshing sound behind him, and Draco had just enough sense of mind to glance back and saw wings? Huge green-gold wings that blotted out everything else. A dragon was hovering in midair, just at eye level in front of him, its wings beating with steady power. It was dark green in color, with whirling golden eyes, and more trappings of green and silver, and on its back sat Ginny. The powerful wind from the dragon's wings blew her fiery hair behind her like a scarlet banner. In her left hand was a pair of golden reins, and she held them as if she knew exactly what she was doing. He almost didn't recognize her. She looked so fierce and intent. She held out a hand. "Get on!" she called, the wind tearing the words from her mouth. "Draco!" He jumped without hesitation, and, clasping her hand, scrambled up onto the dragon's back. He slid his arms around her, which would have been quite pleasant in some other situation, and shouted in her ear, "Oh, brother, we must go back for your brother." Ginny half spun around, her face white. "I only saw you. Ron, where is he?" In response, Draco reached around her and grabbed her hands where they clutched the reins. He hoped fervently that riding a dragon was like riding a horse, which he did know how to do. He yanked the reins hard to the right, and the dragon, to his delight, responded by swerving into a steep, banking dive. Ginny gasped, but stayed bolt upright as they flew low over the tower, the dragon bellowing as its wings scraped the crenellated battlements. He was leaning forward around Ginny now, staring down, scanning the flat top of the tower for Ron. He found him. He was standing, clutching his wand against his chest, and backing away slowly from the two advancing Dementors. Ron looked up and gaped as the shadow of the dragon fell over him. Ginny stared down at her brother in horror. "Ron!" she screamed. Draco flung himself sideways and reached out his hand. "Wingardium Leviosa!" he cried, and Ron's feet left the ground, and Draco was able to catch the back of Ron's jacket and haul him bodily down from the air. He landed awkwardly on the dragon, in between Draco and Ginny, and gave a grunt of effort. As he landed, the dragon bellowed in protest at this new addition to its load, which gave Draco an idea. "Ginny," he yelled, "can you make it breathe fire?" "I think so," she shouted back, left hand white on the reins, her right hand behind her, clutching onto her brother. "Well, do it!" he shouted, and Ginny whipped the reins sideways, pulling the dragon into a sharp, backwards turn so that they faced the tower, and then shouted something unintelligible into its ear.
Dracaris.
It reared back, and Draco had to grab at Ron's jacket again to keep him from sliding off. Flame burst from the dragon's mouth, the color of molten lava. A cascading jet of fire seared across the roof of the tower in a destroying, purifying blast, obscuring everything from view, and just as quickly vanished. Draco stared, and in the deathly silence that followed the blast of fire, a
terrible stillness seemed to descend, like the aftermath of a shattering explosion. Slowly, he became aware of the rhythmic beating of the dragon's wings, heard Ginny's sharp gasp, and Ron's ragged breathing. They were both staring below them, and no wonder. The roof of the tower was bare, burned clean by dragon fire. The Dementors were gone. All that remained was the sword, which glittered, unburned and unharmed, in the middle of the empty expanse of scorched flagstones.
"But how many of you are there?" Lupin asked, reaching absently for a hippogriff crunchy, then, shuddering, put it down. "I mean, how many in the Snake Lord's army in total? It would really help with strategy to have an idea of the numbers." "Not really sure," the American werewolf, whose name turned out to be Peter Whitestone, replied, munching a crunchy. "It's not like the higher-ups gave us a tally of when we got here. But I do know that we have us werewolves, Dementors, Velas, trolls, a few banshees, the gentlemen, some ogrigs, and some skulks." Lupin was astonished. Ogrigs? Skulks? But they don't exist. They're mythical. Peter looked at him in surprise. "Nothing is impossible with the Snake Lord. You ought to know that." Lupin opened his mouth to reply, when suddenly the door opened, and he saw with a shock that it was Sirius, followed by a very pale, very thin Fleur de Coeur in long white robes. Lupin was so stunned that for a moment he barely reacted. Then he saw Peter get to his feet, reaching for the wand-like thing he had tossed at Lupin when he first came in, and reached out to stay his hand. "Wait," he said roughly, and walked quickly over to where Sirius and Fleur were standing. Blocking the pair of them from the rest of the room, he muttered, "You're all right." Sirius nodded, then proceeded to fill him in quickly on the events of the day, while Lupin stared in amazement. "So, we're going to meet them outside," he said finally. "I just came back to fetch you, although it looks like you're doing all right for yourself. That werewolf over there seems to fancy you." Lupin was taken aback, and glanced briefly over his shoulder to Peter, who nodded and waved. "What, Peter?" Sirius grinned. "No, the pretty one in blue." Lupin rolled his eyes. "And even in the midst of a truly bleak situation, you're trying to find me a date. Touching, really." Sirius grinned again. Fleur scowled. "It might not be so easy as you think." "To get Lupin a date," said Sirius. "Being a bit hard on the poor man, aren't you? He's not that unappealing." "No, to get out of the castle," said Fleur, flushing a little across the tops of her ivory-pale cheeks. "There are very few exits, and those are heavily guarded. What we need is a map." "We," said Sirius lightly, trying not to give the word too much emphasis. He hadn't wanted to say anything to Lupin about her being in league with the Snake Lord, and as such, it should have given him pause when trusting her. But she had saved him from her Vela cousins. Fleur must have sensed that he knew something, because she looked down. "I would like to come with you, if you would have me." "Of course you can," said Lupin, confused by how unhappy she seemed. "We can use your assistance in getting out of the castle. We have maps here," he added quickly, gesturing back towards the table where Peter and the aforementioned she-wolf in blue were standing. "How do you know that the other werewolves won't turn on us?" Sirius hissed in a whisper as they made their way back towards the table. "Aren't they in the thrall of the Snake Lord?" "Well, I might have put a will-strengthening potion on the hippogriff crunchies that this lot has been mindlessly munching on for the last half hour," said Lupin under his breath, "and they haven't caught on yet." Sirius grinned, and suddenly an idea struck Lupin. He looked over quickly at his friend. "Do you still have those Zonko's pencils on you, Sirius?" "Yes, but the kids and I had to use them recently, so I have just the one." and Sirius produced it from his pocket and handed it to Lupin, who looked a question at him. "I'll explain later," he said. Mentally shrugging, Lupin bent the soft nub of the pencil to the map of Slytherin's castle. It sparked with energy in his hand as he followed the lines that indicated corridors, doors, stairways, and exits, and watched the tiny dots that testified to the location of the castle's occupants spring into existence and begin to move. It was only when he had traced the gardens and walls that surrounded them that he noticed something strange. "Sirius," Lupin said, beckoning him over. "Look at this." Sirius looked over his shoulder, and Fleur craned her neck on the other side of Lupin and let out a soft curse in French as she stared down at the map. Lupin didn't blame her. Outside the walls of the castle were a veritable heaving mass of dots, indicating hundreds, perhaps thousands of people gathered outside the walls. But the most perplexing of all were the two dots that were gathered towards the front of the mass that bore the names Virginia and Ron Weasley, Draco Malfoy, and Benjamin Gryffindor? "What the—" Sirius muttered. But Fleur, at that moment, interrupted him by quickly crossing the room and yanking aside one of the heavy velvet draperies covering the windows. The werewolves yelped indignantly as bright, silvery moonlight speared into the room, but Fleur ignored them and gestured wildly for Lupin and Sirius to join her. They hurried across the room to the window, and Lupin held the heavy drapery aside as he peered out into the gardens. Beyond the walls, he could see a heaving mass of figures milling about. Moonlight was gleaming off their bright armor, silvery weapons and brightly colored pennants that were adorned with a dark red flag bearing a golden lion. "It's an army," Sirius whispered, amazed. "Ginny went back in time and got an army. How'd she do it?" Lupin shook his head. "They're just milling about, though. What are they waiting for? Why don't they attack?" "They cannot get in," said Fleur positively. "There are walls up all around the castle that prevent an attacking force from entering." Lupin glanced at her. "Is there any way to take the walls down?" Fleur nodded slowly. "Slytherin can take them down, or you can?" asked Sirius, turning to look at her. She was trembling all over, but said, "I can try, but when I attempt to disobey an express order, you do not know the pain. It is blinding, scorching." She looked down at the ground. "But I have much to atone for." Sirius looked at Fleur's bent head, then over at Lupin, who was wearing a bewildered expression. "Remus," he said slowly, "have you got any more of those hippogriff crunchies?" They ran. Both Harry and Hermione sprinted away from the Dementors and blindly into the next corridor, then the next, and suddenly they met with a staircase that ascended upwards into darkness. Seeing no other means of escape, Harry grabbed Hermione's hand and began to pull her up with him. Hermione stumbled, but was able to right herself and kept going. Behind them, the freezing cold of the Dementors began to glide slowly up the stairs. They kept going. Hermione could feel a pain in her knee beginning to ache as they went up and up and up and around and around and around, Harry never stopping until the stairs suddenly ended in a heavy-looking mahogany door studded with brass, the handle of which was carved in the shape of a frog. "Trapped," Hermione thought desperately, feeling her skin begin to prickle as the Dementors gained purchase. She could hear Harry panting beside her, and then suddenly he moved past her to stand on the step in front of her. "Harry, what—" she began, but Harry wasn't listening. He took a slow, steadying breath, then raised his hand and whispered, "Expecto Patronum." Then, louder, "Expecto Patronum!" A silver stag burst from the ends of Harry's fingertips and charged at the two Dementors, who fled before its light and melted away down the stairs like shadows being chased by the rays of the sun.
They were both silent for a moment, Hermione still breathing heavily from the climb, and Harry staring down the stairs as if he expected the Dementors to return at any moment. "Harry," Hermione said tentatively, and he turned to look at her, giving her a wan smile, but it was quickly wiped away as they both realized in that instant that neither Ron or Draco were with them. Instinctively, Hermione reached down and touched the lycanthie at her throat. "I'm sure they're all right," she said quietly. Harry didn't say anything, just nodded, then peeked curiously over her shoulder at the door. "Do you think it's safe to open?" he whispered, his voice sounding strange in the tunnel of the staircase. Hermione turned to regard the door and took a moment to think. From the outside, it looked just like an ordinary door, but this was Slytherin's castle. Anything that looked as if it could be normal might turn out to be some horrible trap. "Yes," she said after a moment, "but be careful, Harry." He looked at her briefly, then ascended the stairs once more to take hold of the knob and pulled hard. The door slid open without even a creak of rusted hinges. He stepped through the doorway, and Hermione followed. They found themselves in a huge room, empty of any occupants. The floor was polished flagstones that looked like the pattern of a chessboard. High above was the ceiling which, like the ceiling of the great hall at school, seemed enchanted to reflect the sky outside. At the moment, it was a brilliant black field glittering with diamond-powdered stars. Huge tapestries hung along the walls, depicting scenes out of a dream. In one, a castle of bone rose up from a bleak wasteland. In another, a silver chariot, shaped like a flower, was driven across the sky by huge, fiery-winged horses that reminded Harry of the horses that drew the Beauxbatons carriage. It was, by contrasts, beautiful and horrible at the same time. Something on the floor caught Harry's eye, and he paused to look at it. "Hermione, what's that?" She looked where he indicated. Inked on the floor in what looked disturbingly like, but certainly couldn't be, blood, was a circle with a 5-pointed star sketched on the inside. Between the points were drawn various symbols: a dot, a cross, a square, an oblong, and something that looked a bit like the letter H. "It's a draxagram," said Hermione, looking a bit nervous. "Circle magic. Wizards use them for summoning magical creatures, especially powerful ones." "What happens if you step into the circle?" Harry asked, morbidly fascinated. Hermione shuddered. "Don't ask." She turned away from the draxagram, and so did Harry. There was a raised dais in the center of the room, which had 4 golden pillars, set in a straight line on the opposite side. Harry could not imagine what they might be for. They looked like the supports for some massive tent, each about 2 arms' lengths apart. A few feet in front of them was a crystal sphere, rising upon the coils of a translucent green base in the shape of a serpent. In the heart of the globe burned a living flame, animate with a life so alien that Harry stared in fascinated horror. It threw violent shadows over the walls, the tapestries, the bare flagstone floor. "There it is," said Hermione, her voice soft as she began to walk towards it, and Harry followed. "The orb." When she was close enough, she reached out and laid a hand on it, not even sure why she was doing it, but feeling that she had to. Weirdly fascinated, Harry did the same. Suddenly, he found himself super aware of Hermione's presence next to him, her sleeve pressed against his bare arm, the long curls of her hair tickling his throat. She turned and looked at him, and Harry could see the line of her profile, marble pale and serious in the dimly pulsing light of the orb. Her cheeks were flushed with excitement. She looked as she did when she had solved a particularly difficult arithmancy problem. The orb was throwing scarlet patches of light over her skin, and he felt his mind cast itself back, as if he were remembering, although the memories that came to him were nothing he had ever experienced. He saw the same room as he was in now, and a woman in a blue dress, stained all over with blood, cradling a dark-haired man in her lap and weeping inconsolably. It was Hermione, and yet it wasn't Hermione at all. He felt the sensation of steel going into his chest, thrust through from behind before his murderer spun him around and lowered him slowly to the ground and leaned over him, smiling at his death.
Cousin, best friend, enemy, murderer.
There was a moment of absolute stillness, and then, for a reason neither of them knew, their lips parted at the same time, and the words, "Alohomora," flowed out of both of them before they could stop it. There was a flash of light from deep within the orb, a radiant flash of deep red, followed by a pulse of deep blue. Something inside Harry tensed almost painfully. Hermione seemed to have felt something as well, because she dropped her hand hastily from the orb. "Harry?" she said, and her voice sounded as if it came from a long way away. At the sound of his name, a mist seemed to lift from his eyes, as if a wind had blown it away. He heard himself taking deep, gasping breaths, and raised his eyes to look around the room, then back at Hermione.
"I think Godric died in here," he said.
She nodded without speaking, and drew him towards her, away from the orb. "I know," she said, and lifted her face to his. "I felt it." Harry didn't say anything else. There was a fierce pain inside him that made up a residual nightmare, the after effects of so many stresses and torments, the constant fear for his own life and for the life of those that he loved. He looked down at her and saw her face, very white in the flaring and fading light of the orb. "Harry," she said again, her eyes searching his. "I love you. You know that," she said quietly. "I always will." He nodded, the tangled knot of emotions inside his chest tightening almost painfully as he looked at her, her eyes dark and earnest. He remembered the first time he had ever kissed her, both of them drenched in rain, and a blazing stab of yearning that struck at his heart. Unthinking, he bent and kissed her now, as he had not been able to for days, even weeks. Hard and fierce, as if hungry for something he had not even quite realized he was starving for. She responded instantly, her hands locking across his back, lips opening under his. She stood on tiptoe, her back against the pillar, pushing her body against his, her head arched back, whispering into his mouth, repeating his name. He felt her body shake as he touched her, and his mouth on hers trembled as he saw another room and another man, with untidy dark hair dressed in scarlet, and a woman in blue, and the light of tawny candles glowing. And then behind them, a door opened, and another man came in, and this one was dressed in black and silver. Hermione gasped. Harry spun away from her, his hand going to the scabbard at his waist, and froze. Salazar Slytherin stood there in front of the glowing orb, and in his left hand he held something silvery gray and filmy, which Harry recognized with a lurching swell of shock that almost knocked him off of his feet. James Potter's invisibility cloak. Long hallways led off in all directions, archway after archway disappearing into green-tinted mist. Creatures were beginning to hurry by them as they went. Trolls brandishing heavy axes, banshees emitting low, spectral moans as they stalked past, Velas looking rapturous and clicking their beaks expectantly.
Sirius now realized that they must be racing to protect the castle from the army outside. Only the werewolves, freed from the call by the spell Lupin had administered on the sly, remained in their rooms, blissfully unaware of what was going on. When he, Lupin, and Fleur had left, they'd left off basket weaving and had moved on to a finger-painting session. It was probably for the best. Hippie werewolves would have been useless in a fight anyway. "What about Slytherin?" Sirius asked as they hurried after Fleur down a narrow, twisting corridor. "Where is he?"
"I do not know," she repeated firmly. "Nobody does. He left instructions that he was not to be disturbed, and nobody would dare disobey him. Whatever he is doing, I don't think he even knows about the army outside the walls."
"My guess is that he's about to make a last bid to reclaim his powers," Lupin said, as they turned a corner and came out into a large circular room. "At his full strength, he will flatten such an army with a thought."
"What is that?"
Sirius stopped alongside his friend and stared. Instead of a roof, the room they were now in was open to the sky, except where it was crossed over by 4 metal chains joined together in the middle, and from the middle, a 5th chain of brass, each link as large as a cartwheel, dangled down into the room, connected by an S-shaped link in the center. A huge serpent, as big as a house, made of overlapping plates of copper and glass, was coiled around and around a tall marble pole, topped with a marble skull with a serpent protruding from its mouth. A sculpted dark mark. Sirius could see through the transparent parts of the metal serpent's body to an intricate system of brass cogs and gears inside, turning in regular rhythm. Black steam puffed from its brazen nostrils, and fire flickered behind its huge, empty eyes. With a determined look, Fleur strode into the middle of the room, walking very quickly. As she moved towards it, the serpent began to slowly uncoil itself. Its tail moved, extending outward towards her, sweeping across the floor. Fleur stepped over it, rocked up her sleeve as she went. Sirius saw her slender arm emerge, the pale skin stained by the blister-black mark just above the elbow. And then she raised her arm and pointed it at the serpent, her face contorted with intense concentration. "Dilenta!" she cried, and a bolt of green light shot from the dark mark on her arm, arrowed straight towards the mechanical snake, and disappeared down its throat. As Sirius stared, transfixed by amazement, the green light from Fleur's dark mark vanished, and she collapsed silently to the floor in a crumpled heap. He looked sideways at Lupin, but his friend had already dashed forward, leaping over the serpent's coiled tail in his hurry to get to Fleur. The serpent made no move to stop him as he lifted the unconscious girl in his arms. Indeed, Sirius might have even said that it was wearing a surprised expression. Suddenly, its head drooped, and there was a thud inside it, as if something has exploded. A good deal of white smoke poured out of its joints, and bright flashes went off behind its eyes. With a tearing noise, it collapsed in on itself, scattering bits of glass and copper across the floor like bright confetti. Fleur's eyes were open now, and when Lupin reached the door, she said in a firm little voice, "Put me down, please." Sirius helped Lupin set her on her feet, and could have sworn she blushed slightly. Now on her feet, she stared past them, transfixed, at the destroyed machinery of the serpent. Then, in a hushed voice, she said, "Listen." They did. Sirius imagined that Lupin, with his extra-sensitive hearing, probably picked up on the noise before he did. "The walls are gone," said Fleur. "The walls have fallen. The castle is open to attack." "Looks like you owe me another turn with that knife," Ron was saying as they stood outside the wards of Slytherin's castle. After the dragon had landed, Ron and Draco followed Ginny back to where the army was grouped. They were mass huddles of figures in the darkness, punctuated by bursts of wand light. A discontented buzzing rose from those gathered, as if from a hive of wasps. Draco had to admit that he was impressed. Ginny had gone back and recruited a whole army, and he vaguely wondered if they might have a fighting chance after all. Then Ron's comment seemed to snap him back to the present, and he turned to glare at the other boy. "I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about, Weasley," he replied smoothly. "I saved your life too." "I'm still 2 for 1, said Ron confidently. "And if I recall correctly, now Malfoy can owe a Weasley anything. Family honor, blah, blah, blah." "You make my family code of conduct sound so eloquent, Weasley," Draco sneered, his eyes bright. "A regular Shakespeare, you are." "Where's Ben?" Ginny cut in suddenly. It's not that she wasn't listening to what the boys were arguing about. She just didn't care. There were more pressing matters at hand. "I wanted to talk to him." "I'll go look for him," Ron replied, and gave Draco a look that could have been called smug, before trotting off to find the man in question. After he left, Draco looked sideways at Ginny. "So, who's Ben? Some poncy git in leather tights?" Ginny stared at him. "Ben is not a poncy git. He's the heir of Gryffindor." "Harry is the heir of Gryffindor," snapped Draco. The cold wind had blown color into his cheeks. Either that, or he was more annoyed than he was letting on. "Do we really need more than one?" "I couldn't have assembled this army without him," said Ginny, gesturing at the people all around them. "I didn't realize that in order to be of use, I needed a contingent of armed forces." Ginny raised an eyebrow at him, curious. "Are you jealous?" "No," Draco said and straightened up, eyes sparking. Ginny suppressed a grin. "I think you are." Draco gave her a long look. "Perhaps," he said quietly, and she got the feeling that he wasn't annoyed, but confused. His feelings for Hermione, which seemed to surround him like a haze of guilt, also seemed to be getting in the way of him feeling anything for anyone else. Deep down she had suspected this, and it was one of the reasons she kept him at arm's length. "Ginny, he began, but was cut off by the sudden reappearance of Ron, followed closely by Ben. "I don't mean to intrude," said Ben, and Draco turned to regard the other man, and felt a cold shiver run down his spine. It was Harry, or Harry as he would be when he got older, except the eyes were different, darker and unnerving to see staring out of a face that he had come to know as well as his own. "Ron said you wanted to talk to me." "I did," said Ginny. "How is Feralus?" "Well," replied Ben, looking vaguely amused, "he had a very good time with you two. You let him breathe fire." Ginny smiled at him, and Draco felt a jolt of something hot scald its way down into the pit of his stomach. "Just the once." Ben smiled back at her. "It's all right." "How goes the plan for getting into the castle?" Ron interjected. Ben looked at the red-headed boy and shook his head. "Wards up all around the castle that prevent this number of people from entering," he said, looking frustrated. "We could try climbing over the walls one by one, but it's like asking to be picked off by Slytherin's army of dark creatures. And if we're going to attack, we need to attack in numbers. We need to attack in force." "Is there no magical way to take the wards down?" Draco asked. His tone was sharper than he meant. "We've been trying, of course," said Ben, either not catching the other boy's tone or not caring. Ginny suspected that years of being around his cousin, Gareth, had made him immune to such things. "I thought perhaps you might have some knowledge, being the heir of Slytherin. I see Hugh marked you with the Signa Serpens." Ben spoke lightly, but his eyes on Draco were hard and inquiring. Draco looked down at the dark mark on his slender arm, revealed where his sleeve was rucked up, just under his elbow. Yes, he said tightly. Do you want to fight? Ben asked suddenly. Ginny met Draco's eyes with her own. She could see the stars reflected there, a lighter silver against the dark irises. He looked intent and hesitated a long moment before speaking. Yes, he said, but there's one thing I'm curious about. What's that? Asked Ben. Did Slytherin have these walls up around his castle in your time? Ben shook his head. Armies were never able to attack Slytherin's castle directly. He always attacked first. There must be some way to knock the wards down, Ron insisted. If it takes magic power, fine. Malfoy's a magician, even he doesn't know all that many spells. Thank you for the ringing endorsement, said Draco irritably. Ben ignored this bickering. He was staring up at the sky, thumbs hooked into the scabbard of his belt. Some larger magic is at work here, he said, looking somber. Strange signs and portents. Odd lights in the sky. Something is up, he said, firmly, and barely had he finished speaking when there was a gigantic rending cacophony. The soldiers all around them yelled and leapt backwards as the walls around the castle collapsed into rubble with a thunderous crash. The wards were down. The castle was open to attack. Everything was in chaos. Sirius had never seen anything like it. He had insisted that Lupin remove the still extremely weak Fleur to the relative safety of the werewolf's den, where she could be protected. After that, Lupin had allowed Sirius to borrow his wand, and Sirius was now edging cautiously along the walls, map in hand, trying to orient himself in order to get closer to the dots marked Virginia Weasley, Ron Weasley, Benjamin Gryffindor, and Draco Malfoy. Thundering down the corridors were creatures of all description, locked in mortal combat with regiments of wizards. A 10-foot swamp troll heaved its axe at a witch dressed in Hufflepuff gold. A beaky Vila screeched and launched herself at a heavily armed witch in Gryffindor red, who dispatched her handily with a combustus spell. A wizard in Ravenclaw blue was being chased round and around the stairwell by Raven the Banshee, who was shrieking and brandishing a pike. Everywhere, Ogrigs were being dispatched in all their shapes and forms, and unpleasant black flying things glared with horribly fierce eyes, diving and biting at anything that moved. And where was Slytherin? Sirius guessed that he must be somewhere in the upper tiers of the castle, since he wasn't showing up on the abbreviated map. This made Sirius even more nervous. What was he plotting? His thoughts were firmly disrupted as he passed a set of double doors. They flew open, and out of them poured 20 or so skeletons, dressed in brazen armor and carrying great axes. Skulks. They rattled and clanked across the floor, and Sirius ducked back against the wall. But one of them, the captain probably, for he had a scarlet plume flying from the top of his brass helmet, turned and glared at him with glowing red eyes. With a hiss, he lunged at Sirius, who whipped out Lupin's wand and hurled a quick succession of spells at the creature, all of which bounced off its armor. He had to duck to keep from being struck by a rebounding impedimenta curse. He heard the whistle of displaced air as the Skulks' axe whipped just above his head, and then a hand grabbed the back of his robes and yanked him backwards as the flashing sword came down, leaving a trail of scarlet fire behind in the air. It struck the skeleton in the shoulder, and the skulk burst apart into a heap of tumbled bones. Silently, the other skeletons backed away, then turned and fled down the hall. Sirius saw the red stones in the hilt of the sword glitter as it was withdrawn, and thought, with mingled shock and relief, "Harry?" He turned around and saw, staring back at him with an expression of concern, James Potter. Then someone was shouting his name. "Sirius!" He turned his head and saw Ginny, Draco, and Ron running towards him. As soon as they reached him, Draco had time to think that Sirius looked awfully white. That was odd. He was in aura. Surely he couldn't have been put out so badly by a skulk. Then he twinged. Ben. Ginny reached out and caught at the stunned man's arm.
Sirius, she panted. This is Ben, Benjamin Gryffindor, Harry's ancestor.
Ben, having sheathed his sword, held out his hand to Sirius, but the other was still looking extremely confused. Was something wrong? Color was slowly coming back into Sirius's face, and Draco saw dawning disappointment in his eyes and felt a twinge of unhappy empathy. Until now, it hadn't occurred to him that a 20-year-old man would be someone who looked just like James had before he had died. Wearily, Sirius held out his own hand. It's nothing. I thought you were someone else for a moment. I'm Sirius Black. A nasty, black flying thing suddenly swooped low overhead, and Ron dispatched it with his wand, splattering green ichor all over Ben, who glared. Before Ron could apologize, however, Draco said, Either we continue to stand here exchanging pointless pleasantries and get hacked to death in the progress, or we can go after the orb. Thoughts? Ginny pointed.
Upstairs, she said shortly, fingering the turner around her wrist. The battle raged around them as they ran upstairs en masse, crouching low. Ginny was quick to notice that being with the air of Slytherin seemed to keep the worst of it away. They raced quickly around the spiral marble staircase, Draco in the lead, turning several corridors, and found themselves standing before a set of malachite doors, carved all over with scenes of battle and court life. Slightly breathless, Draco pointed at the door. The orb's in there.
And so might Slytherin be with a dozen of his minions, pointed out Ron, gripping his wand so tightly his knuckles showed white. Draco looked past him at the heir of Gryffindor, then at Sirius, and then, with a slight shrug, reached out, took the handle of the door, and pushed it open. They all peered around the edge of the door and saw a vast, empty room. In the center, the jade-colored orb sat displayed on its serpentine pedestal. There was no sign of any other furnishings, save a series of strange markings on the floor. I'll go in and get it, said Draco, drawing his sword and looking at the others. You lot, stand guard and make sure nobody comes in. I'm going with you, said Ginny, and shook her head at both Draco and Ron's mutinous expressions. Don't try to stop me, or I'll hex the both of you. Anyway, it'll be far safer in there than it is out here. And she gave Draco a little half-grin that he found rather cute. You two go, said Sirius, who had drawn Lupin's wand again and was looking determined. We'll keep out anything that might come in after you. Draco nodded at him, and at Ben, who was staring off down the darkened corridor, his sword glimmering in the half-light. Ron didn't say anything, just waved them on with a glum expression, and Draco took Ginny's hand and ducked through the open malachite doors. They stepped into the vast circular chamber, and as they did so, Draco distinctly heard the door shut and lock behind them with a sharp, audible click. Hermione stood with her back against one of the golden pillars, her wrists bound tightly to it with slender, steel-strung ropes. Harry, beside her, was likewise bound, only his right hand was also encased in an adamantine cuff which ran through the side of the pillar. When Slytherin had first revealed himself, both of them had been too stunned to react and had lost precious seconds of time trying to recover. Once they had, Harry had shoved Hermione behind him, and consequently, she hadn't even seen Slytherin hit him with a stunning spell. He had collapsed in front of her and, without knowing what she was thinking, reached into her pocket where the glass marble lay and grasped it tightly before Slytherin flung an impedimenta spell at her, knocking her to the ground. She had blacked out momentarily, and when she had regained consciousness, she had found herself magically bound to a pillar, the glass marble clutched firmly in her hand. She could just see Harry over Salazar Slytherin's shoulder now. He looked groggy and dazed from the stunning spell, and there was a bruise on his cheek where the spell had hit him. Her heart ached just looking at it. Why Harry? Why always Harry?
I'm so sorry to have interrupted that tender moment you are having,
said Slytherin as he moved in front of Hermione, cutting off her view of Harry. Hermione looked up and saw him gazing down at her out of his sleepy black eyes.
Would you believe that I once interrupted Rowena and my miscreant cousin, Godric, in this very room, in much the same situation?
He cocked his head, and his eyes raked her face and then her body. She wanted to squirm away, but the ropes held her fast.
A betrayal like that leaves its marks even down through 1,000 years,
he murmured.
You appear to have the same disgusting proclivities that she did. How unfortunate. And I was almost planning to let you live. What a disappointment. I thought you were like her, but years of breeding with mudbloods and muggles has corrupted the pure line of her blood. You are not like my Rowena, not worthy to wear her face, not worthy to have her blood run in your veins. You're nothing.
Hermione squeezed her eyes shut and turned her face away from him. Her heart was pounding hard in her chest, so filled with loathing it felt as if she might burst. Her one consolation was that without Ginny and Draco, he couldn't open the orb. She hoped they were far, far away. You didn't love her, she hissed suddenly. I have her memories, and I know. All she ever was to you was something to possess and to control. After she realized that, she didn't love you anymore. She loved Godric. He hit her then, the rings on his fist hammering up into her jaw, and her teeth cut her lip in a burst of agony. She gasped, and through the haze of pain that threatened to eclipse her vision, heard Harry cry out and throw himself forward, the ropes that bound him to the pillar dragging themselves out to their fullest extension. But it still wasn't far enough for him to reach Slytherin. The Snake Lord turned, looked at him, and smiled, as terrible a smile as could be imagined.
Little heir of Gryffindor,
he said,
you look so much like him, but he was never as slight as you, or as breakable. But like you, I think, the most breakable part of Godric was always his heart. You wouldn't have thought it to look at him, but there it was. Now, watch me.
He smiled, and Hermione heard with dread in her heart a torturer's smirk in his tone. It was oddly reminiscent to her of Draco's voice, as he had sounded years ago, when his only goal in life seemed to be to hurt Harry as much and as often as possible. She tensed, feeling instinctively that Slytherin would go for her as the most direct way to hurt Harry, but he didn't. He lifted the invisibility cloak he had been carrying wrapped around his right fist, and from a pocket of his robes he drew a long, thin knife. He looked at Harry, and then he plunged the blade of the knife into the cloak, shredding it. The knife tore through it with a sound of rending cloth that also held a sound like something akin to screaming. Hermione gasped, but there was nothing she could do. Within seconds, the cloak, that had been James Potter's, that had accompanied Harry, Hermione, and Ron on so many adventures, that had saved their lives, that had been the one thing Harry had ever had that had once belonged to his father, was in ribbons around Slytherin's feet. Harry didn't move or speak. He bowed his head, and she saw his shoulders shake. It was unbearable, the worst pain in the world, to see Harry suffer and to see him look defeated. She wanted to scream and howl in rage and despair. If she could have gotten free of her bonds, she would have killed Slytherin with her bare hands. There was no sound in the room, except the sound of Harry's uneven breathing, and her own ragged gasps in her ears, and the sound of the door opening. The door! Hermione flung herself around inside the ropes that bound her and saw, with mingled dread and amazement,
The double doors swing open as they had swung open for her and Harry. Draco and Ginny walked into the room. Their eyes raked it, passing over the walls, over the Draxogram on the floor, over the orb, and then passing over Harry, Hermione, and Slytherin, as if they had seen nothing at all. An uncontrollable exclamation tore its way out of Hermione's mouth. "Draco!" she cried. "Ginny!" Neither of them turned around or reacted. Hermione's gaze went to Harry, and her heart faltered at the expression on his face. He was staring at Draco fixedly, with an expression of complete shock, as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. She had a feeling he was trying to speak to him, as he often did, mind to mind, and was getting nothing. Slytherin, meanwhile, was laughing, and taking no care to hide the noise he was making.
"I cannot hear you,"
he said.
"They cannot see you. We are behind an obfuscatus charm. Simple but effective. Watch."
Hermione watched, helpless to tear her eyes away, and realized that she could not hear what either Draco or Ginny were saying. Watched as Draco reached up a hand to push back the untidy silver hair from his forehead, and begged him silently to see her, but he didn't. Instead, he and Ginny seemed to be pulled against their will towards the orb, much as she and Harry had been. Together they reached out and touched the surface, and Hermione saw Ginny speak, and then a deep flash of light came from the center of the orb, the color of gold, followed by a pulse of dark green. "No," whispered Hermione, and then louder, "No! No!" But they couldn't hear her. Draco stepped back, his eyes widening, and then he caught at Ginny and pulled her back as the orb began to shake and tremble. Inside the globe, the animate flame flickered. Hermione heard her own breath achingly loud in the silence. The flame shook again, then abruptly it went out. A sharp, cracking noise broke, and the crystal sides of the orb split and fissured to rain down like shattered bits of eggshell. A plume of greenish smoke rose from the shattered remnants of the orb and floated into the air, where it hovered for a moment, then fell towards Slytherin and drove itself into his chest. Slytherin howled as if he had been pierced through with a dagger, and arched his back as the green smoke flowed into him. His whole body seemed to glow brightly for a moment with a luminous emerald halo. Then it vanished. He straightened up then and began to smile. Hermione vaguely heard Draco's voice, as if from a long way away. What the hell? He sounded flabbergasted. She didn't blame him. Ginny looked as if she were about to answer him, then gasped as Hermione and Harry suddenly swam into view. Hermione had one split second to realize that Ginny could see them now. When Slytherin raised his hand, he pointed it at the red-headed girl and lovingly intoned,
"Wingardium Leviosa."
Ginny screamed as her feet left the floor, and she flew across the room with lightning swiftness, slamming into the pole that stood next to Harry's. The same ropes leapt up and fastened around her, whipping swiftly around her arms and legs, binding her tightly. Draco spun around. "Ginny?" He broke off and stared. His eyes went to Harry, and then to Hermione, whom he could now see, and lastly to Slytherin, where they rested with loathing and fear. Hermione had rarely seen Draco afraid. Perhaps it was because Slytherin seemed so different now. She had thought, in the Barrow, that he had seemed far more powerful than she remembered, but that was nothing compared to this. It was as if he had grown many feet in stature and radiated a bleak, shimmering power. An ominously tinted light poured from his eyes, and a halo of intense, pulsing energy seemed to surround him. He stood tall, arrow straight, and terrifying, his eyes black as suns in his white face. He held out his hand to Draco.
"Come here,"
he said. Draco shook his head,
but it was Ginny who spoke.
No.
Slytherin threw his cloak back, and Hermione saw the hilt of Slytherin's sword gleam before he drew it and placed the blade tip at the base of Harry's throat, sliding it down gently to rest just over his heart. Harry shuddered, but didn't say a word. Hermione watched with a horror that nearly took her out of her body. From the expression on Draco and Ginny's faces, they were feeling much the same thing.
Do as I tell you,
Slytherin said. You won't kill Potter, said Draco finally, in a shaking voice. You need him.
I don't need all of him,
said Slytherin, his voice very calm.
I can begin by slicing off his fingers, one by one.
No!
Hermione screamed and jerked against her bonds so hard that they cut into her wrists, bringing blood. She didn't look at Harry, couldn't see him past Slytherin's back. Instead, she looked over at Draco, who was deathly white, although his eyes were nearly black. He raised the sword in his hand and threw it hard at the ground. It hit the flagstones with an echoing sound. Then he put his foot on it and kicked it across the room toward Slytherin. It skittered across the flagstones, sending up brilliant sparks.
Very good,
said Slytherin, and took the sword from Harry's throat.
Come here,
he said to Draco again, and Draco felt his feet move against his own volition, carrying him forward like a piece of driftwood caught in a powerful tide. He fought it, bit down on his lip, and tasted blood in his mouth, but it was useless. The orb had opened, and so Slytherin had his powers back, and with them, the powers afforded him by his bargain with Hell. Draco felt himself driven forward, and then he stumbled and fell to his knees before the Snake Lord. He looked up. Harry, Hermione, and Ginny stared down at him from their prisons of rope. Ginny looked desperately furious. Harry's face was white, set, and unreadable, but Hermione seemed to be struggling to free herself from the ropes that bound her. His eyes flicked to Slytherin, who was gazing down at him with a sort of furious appetite.
We have come to the end now,
said the Snake Lord, and his voice was low and even and resigned. He reached down, and with a gesture that could almost have been called gentle, touched Draco on the shoulder. His eyes scanned the boy's face, and somehow Draco knew what he was seeing. The clean, even planes of cheek and chin and jaw, the gray, silver eyes, the white blonde hair too fine to tangle. There was no love in that look, and no hate, but something much colder and much more removed than even that. Draco kept his eyes fixed above Slytherin's shoulder, kept them fixed on Hermione, who had managed to free her wrist from one coil of rope and was working on the second.
You were created for this moment,
said Slytherin, his voice remote.
I was the master craftsman who planned you 1,000 years ago. But you are flawed, broken somehow internally. I do not think you can be put back together again. I see it as a blemish that will grow with time.
Slytherin made a sound, like a drawn-out sigh that masked the sound of the ropes falling to the floor as Hermione freed her left wrist. Her right wrist remained shackled to the pole behind her, the rope cutting into her skin. Slowly, she raised her hand and opened it up to reveal what she had been holding there since Slytherin had bound her and Harry. The tiny, glowing marble. She clenched her hand around it for just a moment, then threw it hard at the floor. It struck the flagstones and shattered, and a burst of blinding white light leapt up and reflected and split into 4 white arrows. One arrow flew towards Hermione and struck against the lycanthie at her throat. She felt it grow very hot and cold. The second arrow soared towards Ginny and struck her wrist where the time turner was bound. The third flew at Harry, and the scabbard at his side glowed as the light collided with it.
But it was the force that seemed to release itself with tremendous force and shot itself straight into Draco's heart. There was a shattering noise. The invisible puppet strings that were controlling him snapped, and he felt himself falling, hurtling really, through a great, empty inner space. Draco gasped, and Slytherin turned suddenly, almost as if the white-haired boy's reaction had been some kind of signal. The first thing his eyes came to rest on was Hermione, free from her bonds, and staring at him with a mixture of shock and elation. Then his eyes traveled down to her feet, where the shards of the marble lay scattered in pieces. Slytherin's face contorted in rage.
"You stupid little mudblood,"
he snarled, and began to advance on her.
"You think that any action you take now will be enough to stop me? Mementorious!"
he cried, and Hermione felt herself being thrown bodily from the pillar she had been tied to, and suddenly found herself sprawled inside the Draxagram. The air between her shimmered as if it had been displaced, and she heard Ginny cry out in anguish.
"You may not have the blood of Slytherin in you,"
the Snake Lord hissed with casual cruelty,
"but I suspect the demons will take you nonetheless as the heir of Ravenclaw."
A roar of fury suddenly sounded from behind Slytherin, and Hermione had a split second to see that Harry had somehow managed to free himself from his bonds and was now charging at Slytherin, the naked blade of Gryffindor in his hands. Casually, the Snake Lord unsheathed the sword of Slytherin, and the two swords met in midair, the sound of metal striking sparks off each other. He laughed.
"Little heir of Gryffindor,"
he spat,
"you cannot hope to defeat me."
There was more laughter then, but this time it didn't come from Slytherin. The two interlocked in battle turned to look at the source of the laughter and saw Draco, his eyes burning with silver light, his face set and terrible like the sun. "Accio," the boy whispered, and watched in delight as the Snake Lord's fingers pried themselves one by one off the hilt of the sword, and it flew into Draco's grasp. Carrying the sword in front of him like a wave of brilliant green fire, he began to advance on the Snake Lord. Caught off guard, Slytherin staggered back, a look of horror beginning to convulse his features. It was the first human look Draco had ever seen. An inarticulate cry tore itself from his throat, and he thrust out his hands as if to ward Draco off.
"No, stop! I command you!"
Draco didn't stop, but instead brought the sword down, and the blade struck against the Snake Lord's wrist, neatly severing his hand. He shrieked aloud, an indescribable shriek of rage and horror, as fire poured from his wounded arm. The severed hand bounced and fetched up against Harry's feet. Beyond disgusted, beyond anything but a terrible sense of euphoria, Harry reached down and seized the mutilated hand and tossed it to Draco, who caught it, then clamped the fingers, tongue-like, around the hilt of the sword, then turned and flung them, together, into the Draxagram inked on the floor. All at once, Hermione felt herself released from the bonds of the circle, and she staggered back and away from the horror of Slytherin's severed hand. "There you go!" Draco shouted furiously at the invisible forces of hell. "Your half of the bargain, given to you by the hand of the Snake Lord himself. Take it, damn you!" There was a dreadful silence. The Snake Lord had fallen to his knees, clutching the stump of his hand, from which little tongues of flame flickered between his fingers. There was no blood. And then a sharp noise erupted, and the walls around them suddenly split and fissured, long black cracks forking through the walls like the tracks of lightning. Draco spun around and saw Harry freeing Ginny from the entangling ropes. From the middle of the inked Draxagram, several dark shapes had appeared, crouching and then rising. Draco heard Slytherin yelling in furious terror, but only at the very periphery of his consciousness. He was too busy staring. The shapes were not the demons he had expected, but huge creatures, much taller than human men, with eyes like burning coals and black wings shot through with gold. They were both horrible and beautiful as they stepped out of the circle and closed in around Slytherin, who was crouching on the floor. Draco saw him raise his silvery head as they closed in and howled out something unintelligible, though it could have been a name. Draco never knew what it was. He would have liked to have thought that in his last moments the wizard might have had a momentary flash of humanity and cried out for Rowena, but most likely he was howling out one final malicious spell. Draco felt the floor surge under his feet, and something caught at his arm. Hermione, probably. Darkness was pouring up from the center of the Draxagram like fog. It poured over Slytherin, over the demons who stood above him, exulting over the flagstone floor, and then it was upon them. The last thing Draco heard as darkness took him was the sound of the Snake Lord's screams. When consciousness returned, Draco found that he was lying on his back, with his head pillowed on someone's lap. Slowly, he opened his eyes and looked up. Backlit by the moon, a figure was bending over him. He saw long, waving hair and a pale, oval face, dark eyes and a worried mouth. Hermione. She was smiling when she saw he was awake. "Welcome back," she said. He started to struggle into a sitting position. "Ginny, Harry, shh. Everyone's all right." She touched his face lightly and then turned her head. "Harry!" she shouted. "Don't yell," said Draco firmly. "My head is splitting." She grinned at him and scooted back to help him lean up against the trunk of the tree she had been sitting against. It was true that his head was pounding, but it didn't matter. He felt light, as if he had spent weeks in a dark, shuttered box, and now the lid had been pulled off, and at last he could look up and see the stars. For the first time in many days, he was no longer cold. Propping himself on his hands, he glanced around. He was sitting on grass that stretched all around him in a wide meadow in between a circle of trees. Of the castle which had stood there, with its walls and battlements and towers, there was no longer any sign. The sky overhead was streaked with explosive color, blue, green, scarlet, and gold, bright as the aurora borealis, and through the washes of brilliant color, the stars glittered like towering crystal cities. Far off to the right, he could see a glimmer of bright scales. Berylus the dragon, and just below him, two small figures, one in dark red robes, and the other with dark red hair. Ben and Ginny. There was a thud as Harry dropped to his knees next to Draco. He was, if possible, even filthier, covered in soot and bloodstains, but was grinning all over his face. He gripped Draco's shoulder hard for a second, and Draco looked back and gave a half-surprised smile. "Hey, Malfoy, you missed the coolest part," he announced. "Damn," said Draco mildly, "because I was so enjoying the fun we were having right up until I passed out." "It was not cool," said Hermione, looking slightly ill. "After the demons dragged Slytherin into the Draxagram, they all just vanished into the floor with this huge sucking sound. Then everything in the room started sliding down into the hole. The whole castle came apart, piece by piece, and all the dark creatures fled into the woods. I've never seen anything like it. Lupin said it was a retro-dimensional time-shift collapse." "Sounds like I missed some good times," said Draco. "Then I'm telling it wrong," said Hermione positively. "It was quite horrible." "And Sirius?" "Where's Sirius? And Fleur?" Draco asked. Hermione got to her feet. "Fleur is with Lupin, but I'll go get Sirius. He was talking to Ben last I saw." She smiled down at Draco. "Ron told him you killed a Dementor, so he wants to hear all about it." Draco nodded, too exhausted to speak. Even though it was a cool night, he was sitting on wet grass and his body felt like a giant bruise. He felt his eyelids drooping, as if he were sinking back into the blissful comfort of the first real sleep he could remember having had in weeks. "LofI." Harry's voice spoke in his head, and he was grateful that he didn't have to open his eyes or move to respond. "I thought it was time to give this back to you." Now Draco did open his eyes and saw Harry holding something out to him that glittered bright as sunlight in his hand. The epicelical charm. He shook his head faintly. "I don't want it." Harry looked surprised. "But it's your life." "I know." Draco leaned his head back against the tree trunk. "I don't want the responsibility. Not right now. Hold on to it for a little while. All right." Harry looped it back around his throat, looking somber. Draco shut his eyes again. The exhaustion was folding in around him like a blanket. He vaguely heard other people arriving, sitting down around him in a circle in the grass. Heard Sirius's voice saying that the ministry was on their way. Heard Ginny announce that Ben had gone, and his army had gone back with him. There was a soft touch on his arm. It was Lupin, asking him how he was doing. But Harry answered for him, saying that he was fine, just tired, and that they should let him sleep. The voices became fainter and fainter, like music heard from another room. And then one last voice bent close and whispered in his ear. "Draco." It was Hermione, her voice barely a murmur. "There's one thing you should see before you fall asleep." She leaned over, and he felt her hand on his left arm, pulling up his sleeve with great gentleness. He half opened his eyes and looked down, and it was a moment before he realized that what he was looking at was not an object she wanted him to see so much as the lack of an object. On the inner skin of his forearm, which had borne the skull and serpent sign of the Snake Lord, there was no longer any mark. And that is all for this chapter, guys. Again, thank you so much for joining me, and I apologize profusely to anyone out there who can speak French or is French and is listening to this particular episode. I probably did a terrible job of trying to translate all of that French that was in this particular chapter, but the translation thing from Google goes so fast it doesn't really give me a chance to hear all of the syllables. So again, I am truly sorry for that. But anyway, guys, if you are enjoying this, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe to the channel. And if you are interested, I do have a Patreon. I upload my own writings there as well as my spicy art content. But if that doesn't interest you, of course, I do have a Ko-fi. If you would like to support me there monetarily, you may do that. I would much appreciate it if you did. Other than that, guys, thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you all in the next one. Good night.